From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from New York.
From Bloomberg's world headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew. Thanks for joining us on the Monday edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Kaylee, we have made it to the eve of the election at last. One of the most volatile and unpredictable cycles in modern American history. Here we are.
Yeah, just to think of how far we've come from a race that was supposed to be a 2020 rematch. Joe Biden against Donald Trump. Now Kamala Harris against the former president instead, with polls leading up to Election Day tomorrow still showing them neck and neck. No one is able at this time to confidently call this race.
Too close to call. That goes for a lot of down ballot races as well. And Kaylee, we can't ignore the fact that more than 75 million Americans have already voted, raising a lot of questions about turnout tomorrow and how long it's going to take to call some of these races.
Keep in mind, less than 155 million voted in 2020. So already about half of the electorate from the last cycle has cast a ballot, including in some of those critical battleground states. Georgia, North Carolina have already seen 4 million people or more vote, which is 80% of the total that voted in 2020. We're, of course, going to be visiting some of those states this hour and in the hours to come as the candidates are doing the same, taking on the battleground states this weekend, presenting their closing arguments.
We stand on the verge of the 4 greatest years in American history. You watch. It's going to be so good. It's going to be so much fun. It'll be nasty a little bit at times, and maybe at the beginning in particular, but it's going to be something.
And we will win, because here's what everyone here knows. When you know what you stand for, you know what to fight for. We have an opportunity in this election to finally turn the page on a decade of politics driven by fear and division.
So let's get in the field. Covering the Trump campaign for us now in West Palm Beach, Florida, is Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall. What's happening on the ground there, Tyler?
Yeah, hey, Joe, I'm here in front of the Palm Beach Convention Center. This is where former President Donald Trump will rally his supporters tomorrow night for an election night watch party as those results start to pour in. But before he gets here, though, he's spending today crisscrossing the nation, hitting some of those key battleground states that we've been closely covering. Currently, he's in Raleigh, North Carolina. Then he's going to head over to Pennsylvania for 2 campaign stops there, one in Reading, another in Pittsburgh, which is typically considered to be a Democratic stronghold, before ending the day in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Now, something that all these areas have in common is that they are in counties or they are near counties that former President Donald Trump lost in 2020. So clearly a bid by his campaign to try to shore up support, get out the vote in some of these areas where they feel he might have underperformed in last time around. Now, I don't have to tell either of you at this point in the race, it is all about turnout. Those are the voters that the candidates are trying to court for a sense of the messaging that former President Donald Trump is trying to deliver to supporters to get them out to the polls. I want you to take a listen here to him addressing supporters in another battleground we're closely watching, Georgia.
It would be nice. It's obviously not necessary, but it would really be nice to have more votes than they do. But we're going to bring so many things back to our country, and they're common sense things like that. You need to get out and vote. We're going to do things that are going to make you so proud. And we just don't want to take a chance. You know,
now, we talk a lot about undecided voters. Today, when we're talking about them, though, it's not necessarily undecided between Trump or Harris. It's undecided on whether they will go to the polls at all. These are the voters that the campaigns need to mobilize. But it is important to note, as you noted at the top, we are seeing a surge in early voting. The latest count showing us that at least 76 million Americans have already cast their ballots. Joe and Kaylee, that is well above pre-pandemic levels.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall live in Florida for this election week. Thank you so much. Now, as Tyler mentioned, Donald Trump will be ending his day today in Michigan, and that's where we go next. Joining us from Detroit is Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick. So, Romaine, give us a sense of how it's feeling in super tight Michigan, not just at the presidential level, but in the Senate race as well.
Yeah, this is probably one of the swingiest of the swing states. Tyler was just saying that President Trump will be making another appearance here later tonight in Grand Rapids, Michigan. That will be at least his 22nd appearance here in the state of Michigan. Kamala Harris just leaving Michigan just a few minutes ago. She spent the last couple of days through Detroit and in Lansing, Michigan. She has made more than 20 stops here as well, including at least 10 since Joe Biden dropped out of the race on July 21st. Tim Walz also making his way through the state. J.D. Vance scheduled to be in Flint, Michigan, and there's a big reason for that. Of course, the blue wall state, not quite the blue wall state that it used to be. Trump flipping the state back in 2016, Joe Biden flipping it back in 2020, and right now here in 2024, it's all up for grabs. A big part of that, of course, is the level of undecided voters here, probably more so than what we saw in the past two presidential cycles. A big part of that coming from union membership, a big part of that coming from the Muslim and Arab American population, really undecided right now as to whether they should continue their tradition of voting for Democrats, something they've done by about a 3-to-1 margin in past elections. But the time I spent yesterday out in Dearborn and Dearborn Heights, Michigan, really strongholds for the Arab American and Muslim populations, tilting much more to Trump this election cycle. The mayor of Dearborn, a Muslim American, endorsing President Trump, and Hammerantic mayor also endorsing Trump. That's the first Muslim majority city here in the United States of America. Anger right now about the Biden administration's stance on the situation in Gaza, a protest vote, if you will, that could go for Trump or the third party candidate that's dominating the ballots here in those areas, Jill Stein.
A perfect framing of battleground Michigan. Thank you, Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, as we throw the best of Bloomberg at this election. You'll be hearing a lot more about this as we make our way through the hour here. And we want to bring you next to North Carolina, where Bloomberg's Anna Edgerton is standing by with more. Yet another swing state that is too close to call, Anna.
That's right. I've just come from Trump's rally here in North Carolina. He was speaking just a short time ago. And I talked to voters outside, and everyone I talked to had already voted. Now, Trump's base in North Carolina is very loyal, very reliable. But the question is whether he can pull in those unaffiliated voters. There are nearly 3 million people in North Carolina who are not registered with either of the major political parties. And so those are really the voters that both campaigns are targeting. There's also a bit of an enthusiasm gap here in the final week. Republicans, very loyal to Donald Trump, but Democrats have turned out and added people to their volunteer base. There are 45,000 people who have volunteered for the Harris campaign since she became the candidate, and 95% of those are volunteering for the first time. So they're doing everything they can to turn out the vote, to make sure that people who need to learn more about these candidates can and make the decision to actually go and cast a vote.
All right, Bloomberg's Anna Edgerton in North Carolina. Thank you so much. And as we spend our time looking at these 7 battleground states that ultimately could decide this election and how everything will shake out, we want to add the voice now of Lara Brown, political scientist and author of the book Amateur Hour, Presidential Character in the Question of Leadership. She is joining us live from Washington, D.C. Lara, as we look at the battlegrounds in particular, I think over the weekend, everyone was struck by a poll not in one of the swing states. It was the Des Moines Register poll in Iowa that showed Kamala Harris up by 3 points. Obviously, it's an outlier, but it does reveal some things demographically about women and senior women in particular. And I wonder what it makes you think about whether or not Kamala Harris is seeing a last-minute surge in momentum.
Well, I do think that there is a last-minute surge toward Harris, but I think that this is a surge that has actually been underreported for much of this campaign, because so much of what is happening is about the overturning of Roe versus Wade and the Dobbs decision that has forced many women to reconsider not only their presidential votes, but also their partisanship. And this is where there are fascinating numbers when you look at both the Seltzer poll and the early vote data.
Well, interesting if we can add another poll to this conversation, Lara, and that's New York Times, Siena College. They're out with their last blast of the cycle, and it dropped this morning. Really interesting here. Not only are things tied up, we know that in the swing states, but the early vote is giving us a sense maybe of the direction that things are going in the late hours here. Signs that late deciders are breaking for Harris. Among the 8% of voters who said they had only recently decided on their vote, she wins 55% to Trump's 44%. How seriously are you taking these numbers?
Well, I take them seriously because when you look at the overall early vote data, we don't know who is actually voting for whom, but what we do know is who is turning out. And who's turning out are white women who are older, and many of them in suburbs. Because when you look at that data, you do see that there is a gender gap, you do see that it's suburban voters, and you do see that it's more senior voters than not. And I think that this is going to be important as we play this forward. It's also particularly interesting when you think about Iowa, which had a sort of reversal or a lockdown with regard to abortion in the immediate aftermath of the decision. And then you take a look at some of those southern states where Harris and the Democrats are even competing at the Senate level. Those in some ways look not like as uncertain as what we're actually seeing in Pennsylvania, where abortion has been protected.
Well, so as we consider that, Lara, and in the states in which there is abortion on the ballot in this cycle, along with the presidential or down ballot candidates, whatever it is, including states like Florida, for example. And I wonder if that's where you will be watching for surprises, is areas where there are these other measures on the ballot aside from just the candidates themselves. I could add marijuana to that list or any number of others.
Yes, but I agree with you. I do think that if there are surprises that happen, they're going to happen in states that have already placed inordinate restrictions on abortion, and women are already faced with the health care consequences of those decisions.
I want to ask you a little bit more about the undecided voter, Lara Brown, because I'm not sure who this person is. We still haven't met them. We keep talking about them, and I know we're fighting over a very narrow slice of pie here, but that Siena poll I mentioned found 11% of voters remain undecided or persuadable. That number's down from 16% about a month ago. Who are these people? What is making up this rare breed?
Well, I would argue that many of these undeciders are people who actually were what we called the double haters, right? They are people who likely voted for Trump at one point in 2020, maybe reversed themselves and voted for Biden. And now what they're uncomfortable with is they didn't like either choice they had. Harris has been able to turn the page and offer them a sense of change, but many of them are not yet sold because she is part of the current administration. So I think their choice is really, are they going to sort of side with who they did last time, which was the Democrats, or are they going to just skip voting altogether?
Or perhaps pick another choice, which may appear on the ballot in some of these states. Lara, we were just hearing from our very own Romaine Bostick about the movement toward Jill Stein within some of the population in Michigan, but RFK Jr. is also going to be on the ballot in Michigan. The court decided so, and I wonder what impact you think that will have.
I think many of those voters are going to decide it may not be worth it to turn out because they know that in this election in particular, third-party candidates are not generating a significant amount of support. And most voters on Election Day ask themselves if they are comfortable wasting their vote. So I do think we're going to see very little actual vote share at the end of the day for these third-party candidates.
A lot of questions, Lara, about ticket splitting, and I know I get some eye rolls when I ask experts about this, but the fact is all the Democratic candidates for Senate in the races that we're watching are outperforming Kamala Harris in those cycles, echoed again today in that Siena poll. Will ticket splitting be a phenomenon in states beyond Arizona?
Well, I think we are going to see it in some states. I would be surprised if it was, double digit or that it was more than sort of 4% of voters doing that. But there are some voters who say to themselves they'd like to have their incumbent be reelected, but they may have a desire for change at the top of the ticket. And that could, reverse as well. So we will see some splitting because many voters say to themselves, it's good to have divided government, even if all of our political science shows that that is a recipe for deadlock.
Well, yeah, markets might prefer a divided government as we consider our audience here on Bloomberg TV and radio, and that does seem to be at this time what they are betting on. Lara, we've had a long conversation for the last several weeks, frankly, of how the markets seem to have much more conviction than we were seeing in the polls or than most political scientists like yourself were telling us about the odds of a Donald Trump victory. It does seem like some of those bets are getting pared back as we look at what is happening in treasuries, in the dollar, and some of the other Trump-oriented trades today. And I just wonder if this is now the market meeting what everybody knew, or if something else has emerged to get to where we started this conversation on the idea of momentum that actually suggests things are different on this Monday than they were just days ago.
Well, I think what is different is that this is the time when organization actually begins to show. So I think what we are seeing is that the Harris campaign has been organized. They've put substantial resources. They've had thousands of volunteers, and they have been door knocking in all of the battleground states. Former President Trump mostly outsourced that work to Elon Musk and to Charlie Kirk. And there are reports that neither of those efforts have been as successful or really as robust. So I think what we're seeing is the markets realizing that when the election sort of comes down to the wire, they may have made a bet more upon atmospherics rather than the data underneath.
All right, well, let's stick with this for a minute then, Lara, because I have to ask you not who's going to win the election, but when it might be called. There are a lot of concerns on Wall Street that we could go through several days of uncertainty, not unlike 4 years ago, and we know how much the markets love that. What's your take on the days after this election?
I actually think this is going to be called fairly quickly. And the reason why is because both Georgia and North Carolina are poised to count their ballots really before the end of, the late night, early morning on Wednesday, which really at the end of the day, what that means is we'll be waiting for Pennsylvania. But when we have a sense of Pennsylvania, Georgia, and North Carolina, we're going to know about the rest of the states, and we'll have a strong sense of the Electoral College.
Really glad you could be with us on the eve of the election. Political scientist Lara Brown, we thank you, as always, for joining us here on Bloomberg TV and radio. It is on. There's no turning back. And we're here mobilized at World Headquarters in New York until we have a race call. More and more people joining us in the last week or so, I'd say, Kaylee, suggesting exactly what Lara Brown just said, that it's not going to be next weekend or weeks. It's going to be a couple of days.
Well, I think we're all holding out hope for that, keeping in mind that we are no longer in a pandemic as we were in 2020. So mail-in voting may not be as prevalent as it once was. And some of these states have had important rules changes to make this thing go faster.
77 million Americans voting. Our signature panel is with us here in New York as well. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano are on the way next on the fastest show in politics. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. We are live from Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York for election week, and it is election eve. We are in the final stretch here, Joe, as the candidates make their final pitches to some of the critical swing states that could decide this thing, including Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Michigan. It is worth pointing out a lot of Americans have already made up their mind, with more than half of the electorate that voted in 2020 having already cast their ballot in this 2024 election.
That's a remarkable number, more than 77 million. And by the way, records seen in states in the opening days, including North Carolina, Georgia. North Carolina, especially after the damage left by Hurricane Helene, really confounding the experts who thought this would be a different story that we would be telling. Also confounding the experts and Selzer over the weekend. This poll out of Iowa is remarkable. As we listened to her conversation earlier today on Bloomberg Radio with Tom Keene, this, of course, is a very important poll that we track. We talked about it a lot in the early states when we got to Iowa, of course. Des Moines Register Mediacom Iowa poll shows Kamala Harris leapfrogging Donald Trump, 47 to 44% in a state that nobody saw her winning.
Yeah, so it was fascinating to hear from Ann Seltzer herself on this earlier. Here's a bit of that conversation.
It was a shock, believe you me. When I went into the office after the first night of interviewing, no one would expect that Kamala Harris would have leapfrogged over Donald Trump into the lead. We had seen her move in the September poll from where we were measuring Joe Biden as the nominee back in June. And this is really just a continuation of that. She now leads by 3 points, I think. I don't have that number right in front of me, and you'd think I would have it indelled in my brain.
Exactly.
The point, 47, 44, right?
So what's driving this strength for Vice President Harris?
It's a continuation of what we saw in September, which is the difference between June and September were more people, dramatically more people, saying that they were likely to vote. That measurement would be, I'm going to definitely vote. If you just say probably, we don't count that. And that increase accounted for Kamala Harris's bump. So less than 1% of people went for Donald Trump when 13% went for Kamala Harris. And that was the difference between June. It was an 18-point gap in June, a 4-point gap in September. That continues with our October poll, in that the demographics more likely than average to say they will definitely vote or that they've already voted are strong Harris demographics. It's women, it's college educated, it's younger people, it's older people as well. The incidence of voting, if you're age 64 and over, is like 94%. That's a really big number, and she does very well with older Iowans. In fact, she wins by 20 points with Iowa women, and just 14 go for Trump. The margin is 14 for Trump.
If you're joining
One thing to be crystal clear about the importance of older people is older women. Her ratio of win in women age 65 and over is 2 to 1.
Interesting.
That's a huge part of her success.
Ann Selzer driving the conversation today on Bloomberg. And joining us now, our signature political panel. Who else would you want to bore into the data with? Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital, Republican strategist, alongside Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University, Democratic strategist. They're both with us at World Headquarters in New York. Rick, Ann Selzer said something important. Older women, more likely to vote, moving the numbers in this poll. A lot of people wanted to cast this as an outlier. How about you?
Yeah, no, I believe in Ann the Oracle. I mean, she picked off Obama's win in 2008. Wow. She, was the only one who predicted Joni Ernst was going to be a senator. I mean, like, she is used to sticking her neck out. And in this case, she's seen something that is really counterintuitive because, basically the older you get, the more likely it is you're going to vote Republican. And the Harris margins with white women under 30 are like 40%, right? It's huge, but they always diminish as you go up. The movement she picked up was white women over 65 were starting to move toward Kamala Harris, which is very unusual. They're coming right out of the Trump base. And if that continues, especially with non-college educated white women, that could be a real foretelling. But it's about the movement of those voters, not so much the ballot number. It doesn't necessarily mean Harris is going to win Iowa, but she is making up ground quickly with Donald Trump in that state.
So if it's about momentum, when we just spent the last several weeks talking about what felt like stalled momentum for Kamala Harris in a race that was tightening, Jeannie, does this signal to you some kind of 11th hour shift?
It does. I think we forget that Iowa, right next to Nebraska, it's one of the 10 states, Nebraska, that has abortion on the ballot. So arguably, these citizens in Iowa are being inundated with those messages. Ann is also talking about in the congressional races out there where you see Democrats winning by double digits on the back of abortion. So I think part of this election is coming down to who do you fear most? Do you fear Kamala Harris controlling the economy or Donald Trump controlling reproductive health? And given his closing, which has arguably been undisciplined, is probably the most generous way to say it, you may be seeing, or we may be seeing in these polls, people who say, you know what, the damage he may do is going to be more pronounced on abortion and liberty and freedom than hers as it pertains to the economy, which, except for that 12,000 jobs report on Friday, has been macroeconomically getting arguably better.
What do we think about the undecideds at this point? I mean, if you haven't figured this out yet, I don't know where you're living, but the new Siena poll today, 11% of voters remain undecided at this time. Those who have been early voting are apparently breaking for Harris. The 8% of voters who said they had only recently decided on their vote, she carries by 55% to Trump's 44%. What's happening behind the scenes right now?
Yeah, look, I mean, you want momentum at the end of the campaign.
Is that the definition?
Half the voting age population is going to cast their ballot, on Election Day. Even though we've had this record voting, you've still got half as much to still go. And so you definitely want to be peaking at this point. The question is, because you've had such a large cohort already vote, how much of that does she have to chisel away, create bigger margins on Election Day? Bigger margins than typically happen for Democrats on Election Day. Typically, Election Day, Republicans rule the roost. In this case, will she?
Well, I guess that's our question. And when we look at this early voting data coming in, and when we look at the early vote count in some of these states like North Carolina and Georgia, Joe and I have discussed this hour, more than 4 million people have already voted, 80% of the electorate that voted in 2020. To what extent does that signal higher turnout this time around potentially, or is that showing the demographic changes this country has experienced in the last 4 years since the last time we did this?
Yeah, I will just tell you, just in conversations with people, I am astonished by how many people, I would say 8 out of 10 people I talk to have voted already, I myself included. And so, it is astonishing. That said, I'm hesitant to draw from the early vote numbers, as astonishing as they are, because at this point until tomorrow, we really don't know. Does that mean that there's more people who are going to be getting out, or does that mean people are just getting out early? I don't think we know. And one thing I would say about Trump, and I think we need to be cautious about this, is the registration for Republicans is up in many states, including some of these swing states from 2020. Pennsylvania, Arizona, Nevada. So for all the sort of negative signs in the last 24, 48 hours for Donald Trump on the ground and elsewhere, those registration numbers matter, and get back to this early vote. And so I think we have to be really cautious about drawing conclusions just based on that early vote.
Down ballot, this poll finds some interesting effects, but all the Democratic candidates for Senator outperforming Kamala Harris right now. When you're going into an election with that kind of reverse coattails situation, Rick, who does that help?
Well, it rarely helps the top of the ticket. You really see it more likely that if the top of the ticket is running strong, it can help, the coattails can help down ticket candidates. You rarely see the top of the ticket, the presidential candidate, getting the same level of support as legislative candidates or vice versa, right? It's always going to be different. People have different priorities when they go into the polling booth, whether it's their congressman and what they're trying to get done in their community or where they see the direction of the country. The problem Kamala Harris has is she's carrying the burden of an extremely unpopular administration, and that suppresses the voters that she's going to get. So in order for her to win, she would be doing much better if she was just getting the base Democratic vote, which she won't get. But it doesn't mean she can't be the elected president by tomorrow.
Well, Jeannie, we just have a minute left here, but when you consider this split ticket idea, is it more likely that all the states are going to go one way, whatever party wins the presidency also gets the Senate, or that there will be some expectation-defying results?
Yeah, I mean, historically, we say that the House and the White House move together. And so I would normally say they will go together and that the Republicans will take the Senate because the map looks so much better for them. But every time I turn around, as we have sat here for a year and a half, this election has defied all odds. So I'm hesitant to say, but I think at this point, Republicans really look strong as it pertains to the Senate. And that means divided government. And that means, guess what? Really, really hard to get critical things done in this country. Yeah. And we are back to square one where people are frustrated again.
All right, Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis, thank you so much. And we'll have more from our signature panel in the next hour of Balance of Power and, of course, throughout the week. But as Jeannie mentions, divided government, that's an idea that the markets might like. We know they're watching this election in anticipation. So for more on that, let's bring in Bloomberg Markets correspondent Abigail Doolittle. Abigail, happy election eve. What are we seeing?
We're seeing the markets really reflecting the tension around this very, very close election. Earlier today, the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ had been slightly higher. Then not so long ago, down more than 0.5%. Right now, down just about 0.2%. This type of churn really reflects the uncertainty, investors being nervous around the election. What will it mean for the economy? Of course, there's also a Fed decision ahead. The reason stocks were down, though, not so long ago, that had to do with some weakness, still does, with some weakness in technology, such as Amazon, Apple, Microsoft. Some of this could have to do with the mixed earnings that we've seen out of big tech. But this could also be a nod in the direction of the former president, because, of course, there's an expectation that if he were elected, that might be bad for these companies. But you know, the bottom line is here right now, the predicted odds, they are basically spread by 1%. Super, super close election with VP Harris at 54%, Donald Trump at 53%.
Well, that's saying a lot here as we look at stock prices, but also commodities. To what extent are oil prices keying off this election?
So oil right now at this moment up just a little bit to the degree that that reflects, I should say, the election. It would suggest that the economy is doing okay. It may also suggest that markets don't think that Donald Trump will be reelected, or the idea of those tariffs. However, what I would point us to are some other asset classes. We have bonds rallying, which means yields are down. We also have that peso higher versus the dollar. Bitcoin's lower. All of this is a bit of a reversal, of course, of the Trump trade. The Trump trade has been very strong into the last couple of days. Now we're seeing some selling pressure. I think that the number one message, though, has to do with that VIX that we've been watching for months. Right now, very elevated at a 22, telling you that investors are ready for anything, that they think that the reaction out of this election could potentially be a volatile one.
Abigail, thank you for being with us. As always, looking at the markets as we talk politics, they have a lot in common right now. Markets correspondent Abigail Doolittle. We'll talk more in our second hour with Abigail about the way investors are trying to seize on the looming volatility to make money no matter what happens. And coming up, we'll spend some time with Massachusetts Congressman Jake Auchincloss. The Democrat will be with us on the eve of this election. Talk about his support for the Harris campaign and what might come next. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew at Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York. Special coverage of the election on the eve on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kaylee Lyons alongside Joe Matthew, live from Bloomberg's world headquarters in New York on election eve. Tomorrow is the day after, a year and a half of run-up following the campaign trail, not just at the presidential level, where this race remains, as we've told you, frequently neck and neck between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, but also with Congress up for grabs. Yes. 34 Senate seats and all 435 House seats will be decided in tomorrow's vote.
Not all of them worth watching. In fact, it gets to be pretty narrow when you start looking at the races that are actually contested that we're going to spend time on in the throes of our special coverage tomorrow night. Part of our mission here at Balance of Power is to bring you news as it breaks, to arm you with the best information that you can have to make a decision in this election. It's also to help you watch this tomorrow night, know what to be looking at. Bloomberg's Megan Scully joins us from Washington to help us on that front, taking a look at some of the down ballot key House and Senate races to watch tomorrow. And Megan, it's great to have you with us today on Bloomberg. Happy election eve. Let's start with the Senate because we can get our arms around this a bit easier and we will likely know a bit sooner than the House. Democrats have a very difficult map, and the conventional wisdom is that we'll see an historic flipping to opposite parties in both houses. Megan, is that how you see it?
That is what it seems to be. Although, particularly after this weekend's poll in Iowa that caught us many of us by surprise, showing Harris ahead, I am not willing to say anything definitively at this point. But yes, it does seem the Senate map has always been in Republicans' favor. Democrats are defending a lot of seats in states that Trump has won, particularly in Montana, where he's supposed to win by double digits. And you have John Tester trying to hold on there.
Well, and the Tester seat, as well as the West Virginia seat that is very likely to flip Republican because Joe Manchin is retiring, are really the only two pickups Republicans would need to take control and become the majority. But how much does the size of the majority ultimately matter, Megan? Not just in the Senate, but the House as well.
Sure. Well, in the Senate, you need 60 votes to do most legislation. In a unified government, though, Democrats can get, or either party could get things through under what's called a reconciliation process. We saw that with the Biden climate law during his first 2 years in office. But without that 60-vote majority, it gets things get a little tricky, and we haven't seen that since the Obama administration. So the size of the majority, parties always want more, but short of 60, it is complicated to get things done. In the House, it looks like whoever wins that majority will be a narrow one as well. It's only going to take 4 seats, 4 nationwide seats for Democrats to take the majority in the House. And it's looking pretty favorable for them at this moment.
Let's talk about the House a bit more specifically. This is a beast to cover, Megan. You're going to be and your team knee deep in all of this tomorrow night. The fact is, as we mentioned, not all these seats are up for grabs or contested, at least. When we look at the way this will play out tomorrow, we might well have to wait for, and I'm assuming that you would agree, California to come to fruition before we actually know which party controls the House. The big states of New York and California will have more to do with this than the swing states, for instance, that we're watching for president and Senate.
Absolutely. So it's interesting. When you look at the House, you're really looking at about a tenth of the races that are competitive. And if you're looking at it sort of from East Coast to West Coast, we'll know early in the evening. We'll get some kind of sense as to which direction this is going, or if it remains a toss-up with the polls coming out of New York. There are also competitive races in North Carolina and in Virginia. So that will give us an early indication. What I'm going to be watching really closely tomorrow night, though, is the heartland. There are 2 House races in Iowa that look very good for Democrats. And then there is that blue dot district in Omaha that Democrats are also seeking to flip. That could signal kind of which way this is going. Of course, we won't know anything for sure, most likely, until much later in the evening, or perhaps days later. It did take a few days in 2022 to call the House. So, but I think that there might be a moment there, sort of late in the evening after those polls close in Iowa and Nebraska.
Well, and then there's California to consider, which I think, Megan, is why we have to warn our audience about how long it could take for ultimately the total tally of the House to come together. Just can you tell us quickly why California takes so long, aside from its geographic location, polls closing later in the evening?
Polls close later. It is there are 5 seats there. They tend to count slowly. We're expecting turnout to be very high. They don't count the early vote before election night. So all of this is going to just drag this out even longer. And I hate to tell you guys, but we might not even know until Alaska comes in because there is a very competitive race there, Mary Peltola's seat. So we'll see which way that one goes. So it's going to be a long night, and it could potentially extend into Wednesday or Thursday before we even know the House. As Joe said at the beginning, I think the most likely thing we will know Wednesday or Tuesday night, and this is by far a guarantee, but is control of the Senate.
All right, Megan Scully's message, buckle up for the long haul. Thank you so much joining us from Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios. And joining us now from Massachusetts is a member of the House of Representatives, Democratic Congressman Jake Auchincloss is with us. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and Radio. Congressman, happy election eve. It does feel like almost no one is willing to say anything with conviction at this point, but how are you feeling about becoming a member of the majority?
Confident. I think Democrats are going to take back the House. I don't think it's going to be a blowout. Neither party would claim that at this point because of how polarized the country is right now. But I do think that Republicans' dysfunction in the 118th Congress, in which they had multiple rounds of infighting over their speaker choice, in which they brought the country to the verge of a debt default, in which they had to be really bullied into funding our allies, I think is going to speak to the swing voter in those 24 seats that are going to decide the majority, and it's going to give Hakeem Jeffries the gavel.
What do you make of the conventional wisdom in Washington? And we've been hearing this for months and months, Congressman, that the House turns Democratic and the Senate turns Republican. As we talk to the investment community here every day on Bloomberg, there's the old Wall Street saying, gridlock is good. And there does seem to be a preference to have a split Congress regardless of who wins the White House. How would you respond to those people?
I think those individuals are under-indexing to how deranged a second term of Donald Trump would be. Too many individuals are assuming that the same antibodies in the buddy politic would be there in the second term as were there in the first term, but those antibodies have been depleted. The Republican Party is full-on MAGA, and unfortunately we have seen the Supreme Court with its official immunity ruling, we have seen the state parties all supplicate themselves to his whims. And those individuals who were in the White House in term one, people like Jim Mattis, people like John Kelly, even someone like John Bolton, they're not going to be invited back to term two. It's going to be Trump and his two sons making decisions that are in the interests of their own businesses and of their own family fiefdom, not in the interests of the rule of law or the American people. And I think too few on Wall Street are understanding how bad for their business the degradation of the rule of law will be.
But has Kamala Harris, Congressman, made enough of an argument that she wouldn't be bad for business, that she might actually be good for it? Because the prevailing thinking on Wall Street is Trump means lower taxes and higher profits.
Yeah, so first of all, that's not true because Donald Trump wants to put in place tariffs that would cost the average American family at least $4,000 a year and would radically increase the cost of inputs for most American businesses. Tariff is an anti-growth economic agenda in the way that he is describing it. Kamala Harris and the Democratic Party wants to be driving towards an economy that works like Legos, not Monopoly. We want an economy that builds things. I'd like us to put forward an audacious agenda for 10 million units of housing, 1,000 nuclear power plants, building more ships than the entire Chinese Navy, starting more small businesses than the rest of the world combined. We want to be an economy that builds things and does things, not an economy of middlemen. And I think Wall Street, I think Main Street can get behind that vision, whereas Donald Trump is there to cross off names on his enemies list.
Congressman, more than 77 million Americans have already voted. How do you read into that number? What does it mean for tomorrow night?
I don't read into that number at all, actually. I think any prognostication based on the early voting is very subject to confirmation bias. The only takeaway I have from that is that, thankfully, most Americans have ignored Donald Trump's lies about early voting from 2020, and they have recognized that our election system, when it's not being interfered with by MAGA election deniers, is robust, is free, and is fair.
Congressman, I'd like to ask you as well about what we've heard from the current Speaker of the House within the last week. Two suggestions about repealing legislation. At first, the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, and then just days ago, a suggestion that the CHIPS Act passed during this administration would be repealed. He then clarified that he didn't understand the question he was asked, and instead what he wants to do is streamline the legislation. And I wonder if you buy that clarification or if you really think that might be on the agenda.
I think digging into specific policy details is missing the forest for the trees, because the core agenda of the House Republican Party is not actually any specific policy outcome in healthcare, in semiconductor manufacturing, in education. It's nihilistic. Unfortunately, Speaker Johnson is subject to the whims of about a dozen members of his conference who simply don't want to govern at all. He's got a conference of like the Joker from The Dark Knight. They just want to watch the world burn. And again, I think too many on Wall Street are thinking, oh, that means gridlock, and that means that there won't be any threats to our short-term business interests. It's just a very myopic way of looking at Washington. What they should be seeking are guardrails to protect the rule of law and a positive governing philosophy that actually wants to build out the productive capability of our economy rather than bringing us to the edge of a debt default every single cycle.
Kayleigh mentioned taxes. And of course, we're going to have, no matter who wins, a grand debate about what to do with the expiration of the Trump-era tax cuts, the 2017 tax cuts. If it is Donald Trump, what would a Democratic-led House do on that front? Would it get out of the Ways and Means Committee? How do you see that playing out? Because a decision will need to be made next year.
I'm not going to speak for Richie Neal or the Ways and Means Committee. I will say that the first order of business, should the worst happen if Donald Trump be elected, is going to be to protect the Constitution of the United States, because he will not, Speaker Johnson will not, Republicans in general will not. So before we even talk about taxes, we're going to be talking about the institutions of our democracy and how we safeguard them. But in general, we have seen some indications of where there is bipartisan consensus on taxes. I'll give you two examples. One is the child tax credit. Mitt Romney has put forward ideas. Obviously, Democrats are galvanized behind making fully refundable and expanding the child tax credit. That puts money directly in the pockets of working families. And then number two is fixing the R&D tax credit issue from the Trump bill in 2017 and allowing businesses to amortize those R&D tax credits over 5 years at least. That's a pro-growth policy. I think both parties can get behind it, especially if paired with a child tax credit.
Congressman, thank you for the time. Jake Auchincloss joining us from his state of Massachusetts. It's good to see you and welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. Kayleigh, less than, well, a little over, I should say, 24 hours from now, polls will be closing. We're going to be looking at results here. This preamble that has been a year and a half long is about to end.
Yeah, which is wild to consider. In some ways, this election feels like it has lasted for way longer than a year and a half, given everything that has changed over the course of this cycle, including the candidate at the top of the Democratic ticket. What was Joe Biden just months ago, now, of course, Kamala Harris, who is neck and neck with Donald Trump in many polls. And it's interesting as we consider how close the polls have been. That has not been the case when you look at betting markets and how markets have been pricing this election. They're starting to come together a bit more today, and maybe there is some rethinking of the odds of a Donald Trump victory on the eve of this election.
Yeah, of course, we've spent about a year with our own poll in consultation and partnership with Morning Consult. This is an October to October exercise. We just had our last drop, and we're going to talk about the ground that we have covered. The longest campaign of our lives, followed by the shortest campaign of our lives. In the case of Kamala Harris, Eli Yokley of Morning Consult will be with us. Kayleigh will also sit down with Mick Mulvaney, the former acting White House chief of staff, of course, in the Trump administration, who should have some interesting thoughts today.
Yeah, I'm sure he will. And of course, we'll also check in with our Bloomberg team that has scattered about the swing states, including what's going on the ground in Georgia, as well as Texas, where we're watching one of those critical Senate races.
Yeah.
And where abortion could be a featured issue, as we've been discussing with our guests for this first hour of Balance of Power. But we have another hour to go on the other side of this break, and of course, many hours to go as we work through election week here. So stick with us. I'm Kayleigh Lyons alongside Joe Matthew, live from New York on Bloomberg TV and radio.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from New York.
From Bloomberg's world headquarters in New York City to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kayleigh Lyons. It is election eve. It all comes down to tomorrow, November 5th, when millions of Americans, those who haven't already cast their ballots, will do so to decide not just the presidency, but ultimately the balance of the House and Senate. It is the last day for all of those candidates on the ballot, Joe, on the campaign trail. And we know Donald Trump and Kamala Harris will be at work in some of those swing states in this final 24 hours of the race.
Out in force, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, the states that you would certainly expect. This is the real closing argument here. With just about 30 hours until polls start closing, we'll be talking about results around this time tomorrow or a little bit later in our special coverage, knowing that some 77 million people have already voted. And there are a lot of questions about what that might indicate for total turnout. We'll spend time on D's and R's because we don't get that much information from the early vote. But this is an activated electorate, topping expectations, Kayleigh, even in states like North Carolina.
Yeah, including the western part of the state, which was, of course, severely damaged by Hurricane Helene. You are seeing high turnout in some states, including North Carolina, Georgia as well. 80% of the total electorate that cast a vote in 2020 has already done so, at least when we're comparing sizes here, which does point to the fact that while candidates are still trying to make their closing argument, try to eke out those final votes that may fall in their favor in this final day of the campaign, many minds have already been made up.
That's for sure. And we've got new numbers on that, as a matter of fact. We'll talk a little bit later on about the polls that have dropped in the last 24 to 48 hours. And we'll look more at where the candidates will be tomorrow. Kamala Harris expected to be in Washington, D.C. Joining us now from Harris campaign headquarters at Howard University in the nation's capital is Bloomberg's Skylar Woodhouse. Skylar, thanks for joining us. What does the Harris campaign have planned?
Harris will be at her alma mater, Howard University here in Washington, D.C. You know, it's a very significant place for Harris, as this is where she, went to school. She came out east from the West Coast in California. So for Vice President Kamala Harris, being here at Howard is a really big deal. Now, as for the day tomorrow leading up to polls closing, we're still trying to nail down those exact details to what she will be doing. She will be in Pennsylvania all day today, coming back to D.C. late tonight, early this morning. So tomorrow, I think she's just going to be watching the poll, watching the votes come in, talking with her campaign staff, talking with her advisors to see how things are moving. Now, they have been on the road nonstop, both candidates, Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump. But here in D.C., Harris will most likely be at her residence at the Naval Observatory and then make her way over to Howard University for the election night festivities.
All right, well, we're looking forward to the events of tomorrow. Bloomberg's Skylar Woodhouse will be covering them for us. Thank you so much. And as we consider the final stretch here, the candidates are really focusing their messages, Skylar was just alluding to, on the swing states, including Pennsylvania and Michigan, but also an important one of Georgia. And joining us now in Atlanta is Bloomberg's Brett Pulley. So, Brett, Joe and I were just talking about the already incredible early voting we have seen in Georgia. What's it feel like on the ground?
Well, no, you're absolutely right. This morning, earlier today, the Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, did hold a press conference to talk about just that. The amazing turnout, over 4 million people have voted early. He took the occasion to tout his office's work and say that it means that people are able to vote early in Georgia. And he says that he expects another 1.1 million people to vote tomorrow. The early turnout has been so strong that some people say that polling places may be relatively quiet tomorrow compared to earlier years. But, we're about, maybe 17 hours away, certainly less than 18 before the polls open and before the vote counting begins. The candidates wrapped up here over the weekend. Former President Trump was in Macon, Georgia last night, and Vice President Harris was in Atlanta on Saturday for a sort of star-studded rally. And now it's kind of like all is quiet on the Southern Front until tomorrow.
Brett, we were down there 2 years ago with you to cover the special election that brought Raphael Warnock to the U.S. Senate. How has the narrative and the political tone shifted in that period of time, potentially in favor of Donald Trump, or are we picking up right where we left off after that election?
Well, it's difficult to tell how much it may have shifted in favor of the former president. One thing's for sure, it's been quite clear that both candidates have really been zooming in on an opportunity, I think, where men are concerned. And it's black men and white men. For the last, I'd say, probably 6 weeks, you cannot watch the Georgia Bulldogs football team. You cannot watch the resurging Atlanta Falcons without being absolutely bombarded with ads. And so I think that clearly they see some opportunity, I think, to peel off some voters from those areas.
Bloomberg's Brett Pulley joining us from Atlanta. We thank you. I will say being in New York, Kaylee, right now has been quite an education in political advertising, just about every break, with that House delegation fighting at every moment. Joining us now in Texas, we turn to our Dallas bureau chief. Bloomberg's Julie Fine is joining us now. Julie, this is your moment. We've been talking about this for months, and this Senate race does seem to be in play. What can you tell us about the future of Senator Ted Cruz's political career?
Well, Senator Ted Cruz says that he always runs like he's behind. He's not behind in this race, but in many polls, it is within the margin of error. What we're seeing here in Texas are lines. We saw lines last week and the week before, so we have that feeling that the turnout is going to be high. This is what you guys have to look at. There are more than 1.5 million new voters since Senator Cruz ran against Beto O'Rourke in 2018. Wow. And the difference in that race was 2.6. So again, it is an uphill battle for any Democrat in the state of Texas. None have won statewide office in the past 3 decades. But I can tell you that a lot of Democrats here are feeling, I don't want to go out and say confident, but I will say hopeful about this race.
Well, and I guess the question is what the issue is that is making them feel that way, or making Colin Allred a more serious contender against Ted Cruz. Julie, is it abortion in Texas?
Abortion has been a cornerstone of his campaign. He has often appeared with women who are telling their personal stories when it comes to abortion and women's health care. Another thing you're seeing in this campaign is what I call the battle for Texas. Ted Cruz is running in Keep Texas, Texas. You've got Colin Allred talking about the state itself and the changes that we have seen here. So we now have to see what really sticks. Now, what's really interesting is today you've got Colin Allred doing a somewhat media blitz on the airwaves. He has barnstormed this past week, but he's really been in the cities. Ted Cruz, 3 events today. They are in the suburbs of the city. Cruz knows that he needs the suburbs to show up and show up big for him, and he needs to turn out his base.
All right, Bloomberg's Julie Fine, our Texas bureau chief, will be watching that race very closely, as she has been all cycle. Thank you so much. And as we consider the abortion issue in particular, Joe, this is one, as we've had these conversations here on Balance of Power frequently throughout this cycle, to what extent it may be a driver of turnout, given with everything we have seen in special elections, in the midterms, since the overturning of Roe v. Wade, it does tend to be higher turnout votes when abortion is on the ballot and drive more women in particular to the polls. And women, of course, a group that Kamala Harris has consistently polled better on than Donald Trump.
We've seen that borne out in a number of states, including Kansas, if you remember, going through the midterms, the way this was impacting. It's kind of the unquantifiable issue, though. You know, we are seeing polling showing abortion right up there with the economy in some areas today. Siena, New York Times pointed that out. But the Ann Selzer poll also makes us wonder, is that what is motivating women over 65 in a state like Iowa? It's pretty remarkable to consider.
Yeah, women overall in Iowa, 20% more likely, or 20 points more likely for Harris than for Donald Trump. So for more on the polling we are seeing in this final stage of the race, joining us is Eli Yokley from Morning Consult, where he is U.S. politics analyst. We, of course, have been working with Eli and the Morning Consult team here at Bloomberg for a year on our swing state poll that just came to a conclusion last month. Eli, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. Obviously, a lot of people are looking at that Iowa poll as an outlier, but is there something revealing in the Iowa poll that you're also seeing in your own data?
Yeah, I mean, this is a close contest nationally and in these key states. I think the point that we saw in Iowa about women and older voters proves true. Kamala Harris is doing well with both of those groups nationally. Donald Trump's doing a little better with men. We'll see how this bears out. I think that a lot of people find it hard to believe that Kamala Harris would be able to pull off a victory in Iowa, but even movement against Trump there could suggest some negativity for his campaign in other states around there. Think about places like Wisconsin that are very white as well. Abortion's a big deal there, but we shouldn't forget that Trump's also been campaigning on raising tariffs on other countries that would probably spark some retaliatory efforts by other countries. That's something that would really weigh on farmers, be it when they go to buy a tractor or when they go to sell their goods. That might be weighing on people there just as much as some of these other issues.
So what are the chances, Eli? You do this for a living. This has been quite an experience for pollsters over the past year. We're struck by the consistency in your polling that has found this essentially a tied race ever since Kamala Harris got to the top of the ticket. If we're too close to call right now, likely something's going to break in one direction or the other. Will there be a reckoning? Either way, for the polling industry, for the way you look at the sample, for the people you're contacting following Tuesday night?
There's always a reckoning. We always get these questions after elections. You know, I think one of the big things that we are going to be looking at after the election is this debate over weighing by past vote choice. A lot of pollsters do, a lot of pollsters don't. Ann Seltzer, I don't think, does, for example, in Iowa. Those kinds of questions, I think, are going to be asked by the industry. But hold your breath a little. Don't hold your breath on this. It's going to take a while to do a full accounting here after the election. It takes a while for all these states to get their ballots counted and to start doing those kinds of analysis. But, you know, look, a lot of the numbers are in line across the map. Every pollster, I think, is finding a close election nationally. And in a lot of these key states, the differences are pretty marginal right now. That is what leads us all to say this is going to be a pretty close election, but I guess we'll find out tomorrow.
Well, or the next day or the day after that, depending on how long it takes to actually tally all of this up. If it's as tight as all the polls suggest, it could take some time to actually count every vote. Eli, as we consider that, though, with the amount of early voting we have already seen, do you have any sense of ultimately what that is telling us about what turnout is likely to be? How many votes will there be to be counted that we're going to have to work our way through in the hours after poll closings?
Yeah. I mean, for example, in North Carolina, it's, I think, over half right now of the state's registered voter population has cast ballots. And by the way, it's higher in those places that got struck by the hurricanes earlier this year. I think it's somewhat hard to parse out. I think the early voting and the mail-in voting rules have changed. And 2020 was obviously a strange year for how this works. I think maybe this election will be a better benchmark looking ahead at how what you can extrapolate from those. But you know, what we've noticed this in our data we've been collecting nationally is sort of a mode difference in terms of how you cast your ballot might be more predictive of who you're backing. I mean, early in-person voters are more likely to be supporting Donald Trump. Those casting their ballots by mail are more likely to be supporting Kamala Harris. I think that Trump might have a bit of an advantage on election day votes. And so that might add some time as we're trying to find results, just as some of these states are counting those mail-in ballots that may be more likely to be favoring Kamala Harris.
So, Eli, help us rationalize some of the numbers that we're seeing here on election eve. New York Times Siena says among the 8% of voters who said they had only recently decided their vote, I can't imagine what took so long, Harris wins 55% to 44%. We have 11% voters remaining undecided. But when you look at the big election models here, 538 has odds favoring Donald Trump, 53 to 47. Nate Silver has something close to that, 51% odds for a Trump win. The Hill, odds of a Trump win, 54%. The Economist has it as a coin flip. Why should the Harris administration be projecting optimism when you have numbers like these?
You know, I mean, it's going to come down to who votes. And the Harris campaign had a big weekend knocking on thousands and thousands and thousands of doors in Pennsylvania. They've got a strong field operation. That means they're talking to people. A lot of that operation has been exported by the Trump campaign to other Republican actors. So the Harris campaign's optimism might be coming from what they're hearing on the ground from voters. Late breakers have had a chance to listen to a bit of an unfettered Donald Trump as he's become more Trumpy and less restrained in recent weeks. The kinds of information voters have been taking away about Kamala Harris, by the way, continues to be overwhelmingly positive, as it has throughout her campaign. The vibes are on her side. The question is just going to be who's casting ballots in all these very, very, very close contests.
Well, and we know that by and large, the vibes among women are on Kamala Harris' side. That doesn't remain the case, though, with men and young men in particular, Eli, who do tend to be lower propensity voters. Are we seeing signs, though, that they may actually be willing to show up in a way they haven't in past cycles this time around?
Yeah, I think we're seeing energy among young people. I think the challenge here is, you know, Kamala Harris's numbers among young voters are just less than Joe Biden's were 4 years ago. And that is consistent nationally. It's a 5-point decline, I think. And then in some of these key states, the margins we're picking up in our final surveys in Arizona and Wisconsin are just far worse for a Democratic candidate among young people than you'd expect that to be. I don't know that they're turning anti-Democratic party entirely, but we've been picking up on an ideological shift among young voters for a few years now. They're not more likely to say they're liberal, but they are more likely to say they're moderate. And so that might be working in Republicans' favor in the long run.
We'd love to know what your expectation is, Eli, on when we get a race call, at least for the top of the ticket. I know the House might be a little bit more complicated, but are you going to bed tomorrow night, waking up to find out on Wednesday, or are you staying up because we might know?
I'll go to bed. I bet it's close to. I'm going to be on Bloomberg on Wednesday morning. Look, I bet it's Thursday. I think that it'll happen this week a little sooner than it did back in 2020. That's my only prediction I'm going to make on your airwaves today.
So that's on Fed Day, Kaylee.
Yeah. Wouldn't that be
Bloomberg
something?
do when that happens at the same time?
That's a good question. We should talk to management. It's going to be a big day. A Fed decision, likely a 25 basis point rate cut, and then potentially a call if Eli Yokley is to be believed, politics analyst, U.S. politics analyst at Morning Consult. Thanks, Eli, as always.
Thanks, Eli.
For joining us. The fact of the matter is, Joe, no one knows how long it will take to call, or for that matter, who can win. And anyone who is telling you those things with conviction right now might be a little overconfident.
That's why I'm not sure why we're hearing more and more people say this. Is it because there are fewer early votes than during the pandemic, therefore less counting after the fact? We've got a couple of states, including Pennsylvania, that do not start counting until 7 o'clock tomorrow morning, the ones that have been sitting on the shelf this whole time. Or is it just aspirational?
It may be a little bit of both, but there are new rules in some of these states, including the Sun Belt states in particular, that could speed up the count. It also becomes a question if whether or not a landslide would be what is needed to actually have an early call. If it's abundantly obvious who's winning because they're picking up more than the battleground states that they need.
Got a new poll, by the way, speaking of numbers, PBS News, NPR Marist. Donald Trump behind Kamala Harris. She leads 51% to 47%. Margin of error, 3.5%.
That's nationally. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons, broadcasting live this election week from Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York. It, of course, is the eve of the election, the final day on the campaign trail for both of the presidential candidates, former President Donald Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris, who will be crisscrossing a number of swing states, at least in Donald Trump's case. Harris will be spending her day entirely, for the most part, in Pennsylvania after departing Michigan as they try to make their closing arguments to the very few undecided voters that may still be out there.
Yeah, the closing arguments have been interesting. The headlines painting a darker picture for Donald Trump. I'm not sure exactly how to characterize Kamala Harris. Kaylee, is really interesting. She never mentioned his name in her speech last night. Trump did talk about her quite a bit, as well as the media covering that rally. Can we get a taste of what Donald Trump had to say last night? Here he is.
What we have really over here is the fake news, right? And to get me, somebody would have to shoot through the fake news. And I don't mind that so much.
Speaking there in Pennsylvania, where the first attempted assassination, of course, happened in Butler.
Yeah, and that's not the only time we have heard Donald Trump suggest things around guns or shooting in recent days. He also, at one point, talked about former Republican Congresswoman Liz Cheney and how she would feel facing down the barrel of multiple weapons. That's something that Vice President Harris responded to earlier.
This must be disqualifying. Anyone who wants to be president of the United States who uses that kind of violent rhetoric is clearly disqualified and unqualified to be president. Representative Cheney is a true patriot who has shown extraordinary courage in putting country above party.
Let's assemble our signature panel for more on all of this. Jeannie Shanzano, Senior Democracy Fellow with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, is with us, Bloomberg Politics contributor, alongside Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital, Bloomberg Politics contributor, Republican strategist. It's great to have both of you with us here. Rick, you had said a few days, if not weeks ago, I've lost track of time entirely in this campaign, these may be the worst ever closing arguments in the history of modern presidential politics. How are we doing today?
Yeah, I think that that would apply to maybe the last month. Yeah. So I think for Donald Trump, ever since the Madison Square Garden event, he's been sort of on a retribution tour, right? I mean, he is not reading his speeches. He's going negative at the rallies. He's got his grievances in full display. And his campaign staff are going overtime trying to clean up the messes that he's creating and try and keep it on kilter for the close. I would say, on the other hand, Harris has changed her spin. She has not been going negative on Trump, as you pointed out in the earlier segment, and has actually returned to a very positive, unifying message. Now, that is usually the message of someone winning a campaign. Let's go positive, fill in the blanks, show leadership, be presidential. Usually when you're doing the recrimination tour, you're losing and you're trying to use every minute to put some negatives on your opponent. I don't know if that's the case because all the polling data we see says it's dead even. So why they took the two different paths, I don't know. Maybe they're seeing something in their surveys.
Well, yeah, especially after spending weeks focusing on the threat to democracy, on Donald Trump being characterized as a fascist, going with darkness instead of the joy that they were all talking about at the beginning of her campaign. Jeannie, are we going to, when the results come in, whether it's tomorrow or in the days that follow, if she does not win the race, will that be why? Should she have ever gone negative in the first place?
I think it'll be, a lot of time for us to think about where she went wrong, and of course on the flip side for Donald Trump, if he did. And I think it's important to underscore how utterly irresponsible this is for Donald Trump. Not only is it a bad closing, historically bad, but we are talking at a time when you have election workers across the country fearful for violence. We have snipers on roofs, we have drones, we have 2 states have already called out the National Guard. We have the Arizona Secretary of State saying he's wearing a bulletproof vest because people are so worried about election security. And yet Donald Trump goes out this weekend and talks once again about shooting people. This time press, just a few days before, Liz Cheney, somebody who is his political opponent. It is utterly irresponsible, and it is mind-boggling to me just from a campaign perspective, because this is the nonsense that people don't like about Trump. If he could just stick to the economy and immigration, he would really, really have a good shot of winning this. But this is not the way to close.
A race too close to call. Kamala Harris doesn't even mention the name Donald Trump. Is that smart at this stage?
I think that it is what they've decided to do is, to Kaylee's point, get back to the joy if they can. I think she is feeling good. She's feeling confident. I think she's got to be very careful here because there are also several signs that say this is good for Donald Trump. Just one of them is the increase in Republican voter registration across the country since 2020. So this is going to be tight all around. I would, say she can be cautiously optimistic, but it's anybody's game, as all of these polls we've been talking about tell us.
Well, and as we consider the increase in Republican registration or the increase we've seen in Republicans voting early compared to 2020, Rick, Kamala Harris has been trying specifically to reach out to Republicans, hence why she's been campaigning with Liz Cheney, who was the subject of the remark that we were just discussing. Is that really the group that we need to be watching, people who may have been registered Republicans who would decide not for Trump versus others who would maybe just not participate?
Suffice it to say, there have been very few voters that have been considered up for grabs in this election. And both campaigns, I think, have actually done a good job of driving their own base vote throughout this campaign, right? So the concept has been get as many of our people out as we can to vote and then pick up the, I wouldn't call them stragglers, but the more narrow band votes. For Kamala Harris, disaffected Republicans in these swing states could amount to as many as 20 or 30%, right? These are folks who voted for anybody but Donald Trump. And so I think it's a good strategy. And Donald Trump has been after, on his own part, disaffected minority voters within the Democratic caucus who believe that his economics are going to do better for them than a Harris administration. So both of them are trying to peel away pieces of their coalition in a way that could be decisive on Election Day.
Big celebrity bash tonight in the closing act, at least on the eve of the election for Kamala Harris. Did you guys see this? In Pittsburgh, Katy Perry. Philadelphia, my goodness, Lady Gaga, Fat Joe, Ricky Martin, The Roots. Freeway, DJ Jazzy Jeff for the old people. I could go on here. Oprah Winfrey will also speak in Philadelphia. Who's this helping?
You know, it's all about momentum and getting excitement around, getting the vote out. What's interesting is the Democrats have a new phenomena that they have to really deal with, which is they have to drive Election Day vote. Typically, they've got most of their vote in early, and they have some level of an advantage, and it's not as complicated. This time, as you've said, Republicans have done an amazing job of getting early vote to the point where it exceeds the Democratic early vote in 2020. And so now the Democrats have to rely on Election Day to be able to win an election, and that's something they're not used to doing. So, yeah, maybe something like this that creates a lot of attention and excitement will remind voters, oh, I'm supposed to get out and vote.
It also raises the question, as we've been trying to remind our audience frequently, that it may take some time to figure this out, that there could be a mirage effect early, as we saw in 2020. If you think back to Pennsylvania, at midnight, Trump was up, 13 points, at which point they were saying stop the count. Obviously, only for Joe Biden ultimately to win Pennsylvania. With the kind of numbers we are seeing, though, with early voting with Republicans, Jeannie, do you expect that mirage effect will show up in 2024, or should we not brace for it?
You know, I think we should brace for it because I don't think we know. And I am always cautious about using the early vote numbers at this point as indicative of anything. We don't have a huge history on a big early vote like this. We have some, but last time around, we were in the midst of a pandemic. So I think that is always something to keep in mind. So, you know, I also think people just have to remember the fact that, you know, we could get a lot of people who are concerned if they see a vote going one way or the other. And we want everybody to remember the entire vote has got to come in if it's going to be as close as the polls suggest before we take anything away from it.
When we talk about closing arguments, it's not just speeches, of course, it's ads. We've got these 2-minute ads running now, Rick. I don't know your thought on this. Harris, a 2-minute ad across the country, a 2-minute spot nationwide here that includes a clip of her rally at the Ellipse. I remember Barack Obama buying some pretty huge airtime in the closing stages of your race in 2008. Does this stuff help, or are we just spending the money we have left?
Yeah, I think with Obama, it was a victory lap. The polls were pretty clear, and the early vote was decidedly Democratic. And so I think that was just a thank you to his supporters. I mean, he's declaring victory ahead of Election Day, which is fair. I think in this case, when the election is so close, I really don't get it. Not as many people can see a 2-minute ad or a 60-second ad as who see a 30-second ad. And the ability to, to actually get a message out of a 2-minute ad is significantly less than a repeated effect of hearing a 30-second ad. We know that. That's, clear in the campaign technology. And yet the Harris campaign has been in love with these long format ads, and nobody within this sort of media community, Democrats I know, who think it's a good idea. They're pretty. They're really nice to watch.
They're expensive, too.
But if only the voters you have are watching them, what's the point?
Yeah.
Well, and it's an excellent reminder of how much money has been raised and spent this cycle. Literally, we're talking figures in the billions here. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, our signature political panel, here with us for election week and on this election eve. Thank you so much. Now, on the subject of money, we want to get back to the markets and check in with Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle. Abigail, with just one day to go, having had weeks, months to bet on a Trump trade versus a Harris trade, what trade is winning the day today?
Not a lot of action right now, Kaylee, interestingly enough. It's a neutral trade. It's a churn trade. Investors are treading water. Right now, that S&P 500 down about 0.1%. The NASDAQ 100 down less. This after stocks had been down even more. They had been higher. This is a long way of saying that markets are jittery. They're uncertain about who is going to win. They like certainty. They want to know whose policies are going to be put in place, especially around taxes and capital gains. What's really interesting, the Trump trade, after doing very well week after week, cooling off, all of this showing up in that VIX that we've been following, the volatility index. It's well above a 20. That's a way of saying that investors are betting on the idea that we don't know which way markets are going to go. And there's two ways that we could look at this. One would be that investors are buying vol to profit off of this uncertainty. I was speaking to Steve Sosnick, though, over at Interactive Brokers. He thinks this is hedging. He thinks that this is big investors. They need to hedge against the possibility of more uncertainty, and in particular, if this election is to be contested, which of course we don't know, but if that were to happen, that would be a big problem. And right now, VP Harris and the former president, Donald Trump, neck and neck on Predict It.
All right, Abigail, fascinating as always. Thanks for being with us. Bloomberg Markets correspondent Abigail Doolittle, from the predictor market to the stock market to the crypto market. Kaylee, a former forte of yours, is really actually we've seen an enormous amount of action in crypto as traders try to place bets on one direction or the other. It's become a real barometer of the mood here.
Yeah, and of course, the best thing about it is that it's constant. This isn't just like the regular markets that only trade weekdays within certain hours. Bitcoin is trading all the time. So it is a way, perhaps, that you can caption the live action as we're seeing just moves on the margin here in the final stretch of the race. Donald Trump, of course, having been vocally very accepting of crypto now, not so when he was actually in the White House, while Kamala Harris has not been quite as loud about her policy that she says would support, ultimately, innovation.
These are all the things we're going to be watching, not just tomorrow, Election Day, but in the days that follow as we wait for some conclusion. And coming up, we'll spend some time with former acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons at World Headquarters in New York. It's great to have you here on the eve of the election. Kaylee, it's all about closing arguments right now, and interesting to see how the candidates are spending their time on this last full day of campaigning. Kamala Harris, Scranton, Allentown, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia. She's covering essentially the entire state of Pennsylvania. Trump, Raleigh, North Carolina, then Reading, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Grand Rapids, Michigan at the end of the night. Not a mystery as to why.
No, I mean, Pennsylvania and its 19 electoral college votes could ultimately be what makes or breaks this presidential race for either of them. So no surprise to see that on their schedules today, in addition to some of the other battlegrounds that will be just as important to watch tomorrow on election night. And of course, on election night, Donald Trump will be in Florida, but he has a lot of stops to get through on this day before he heads back home. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall is in West Palm Beach, Florida for us now. So Tyler, walk us through the schedule.
Yeah, hey, Kaylee, I'm here in front of the Palm Beach Convention Center where security is starting to heighten. You can probably see over my shoulders the barricades going up, Secret Service doing their sweeps ahead of former President Donald Trump's election night watch party here tomorrow. But before he gets here, we know that he is hitting those key swing states that you just mentioned and pitching his closing argument to voters. And while he hasn't necessarily shied away from some of his more controversial rhetoric in the run-up to Election Day, he does appear to be crystallizing around what he is calling a simple question to voters, which is whether or not you are better off today than you were 4 years ago. He started his rally in Raleigh, North Carolina with that question earlier today, and all of his rallies over the weekend with that, in an apparent bid to tie Vice President Kamala Harris to the current administration that she is part of. Now, we actually get a little bit of an insight into this exact issue with our recent Bloomberg News Morning Consult polling, which asked voters whether or not they were better off today or 4 years ago when it comes to their personal finances. Of course, the economy, a top issue in this election and a top concern for voters, despite some recent bright spots when it comes to economic indicators. Joe and Kaylee, the poll found that 51% of likely voters in the 7 battleground states say that their personal finances were better off 4 years ago under former President Trump. 36% say that they are better off today. It remains to be seen if that translates into votes and momentum for the former president.
Tyler, I want to hear more about Donald Trump's closing argument. The front pages this morning paint a picture of, in the case of the New York Times, specifically a dark and dour, I believe the words used by the paper, closing argument from Trump. But of course, he speaks for an hour, sometimes 2 hours on end. What is actually the closing argument to voters today, beyond the bluster, beyond some of the crazier talk that we've heard? When it comes to policy, what does he want us to know?
Right, exactly. It goes back to this question about whether or not you are better off today than you were 4 years ago, trying to highlight the economy, which is repeatedly an issue that he pulls well on. It is also repeatedly an issue for some key voters that his campaign is trying to turn out. We know going into this election that there's going to be a gender divide, that Vice President Kamala Harris is polling better when it comes to support from female voters. And his campaign is really trying to target a specific demographic that doesn't necessarily turn out in as big as numbers, and that is young men. But polling does show us that they are leaning more conservative, but that also they are particularly weary when it comes to their own economic outlook, two things that should, in theory, bode well for former President Trump. But that's going to be no easy task. Joe, exit polling from 2020 shows us that only about 4% of the Americans that voted in that election were men between the ages of 18 and 24.
And finally, Tyler, when we hear from Donald Trump in Florida, presumably at some point tomorrow night or in the wee hours of the morning, is there any sign that if he is not seen winning, if not enough races are called for him, that he'll be planning to make a concession speech?
Right, so we don't have that exact information yet, but it does appear that his rhetoric on the campaign trail leading up to today would suggest that he is getting ready to contest the election results if he does not win. It is important to remember that after the 2020 election, Trump and his allies filed more than 60 lawsuits challenging those results, and both sides of the aisle have been investing heavily to prepare for any potential litigation related to this. A recent Bloomberg News analysis found that since 2023, so far, at least 157 lawsuits have been filed relating to this election just in the run-up to the election. So this is clearly something that both sides of the aisle are gearing up for and getting ready as both early ballots come in, but then also the election day votes come in.
Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall will be leading our coverage from the ground tomorrow night in our special coverage live from West Palm. Tyler, thank you so much. For more on the Trump campaign's closing arguments and Republicans' chances of keeping control of the House, we're joined by someone who's worked on both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, former acting White House Chief of Staff, co-founder of the House Freedom Caucus, Mick Mulvaney. He's with us from the nation's capital. And Mick, it's great to see you. I wonder how you would describe Donald Trump's closing arguments here. You saw that headline in the New York Times, dark and dour tones. Trump says he shouldn't have left the White House. He said as well in that same event he doesn't mind if reporters are shot at. This is the noise, Mick. Some people are offended by it, understandably. What's the part that counts, though, for voters trying to make up their minds?
Not much. I mean, if you haven't made up your mind right now, then you're not going to make up your mind. There was an interesting op-ed in the Wall Street Journal this weekend that said, look, if you're still undecided, please don't vote because it just means you're not able to make a decision. Don't cancel the decision of somebody who can actually think this through. I don't put much weight on closing arguments. I've seen the narrative, Joe, against Donald Trump. Then I go, I see the headlines, then I go actually watch the videos, and the headlines and the videos don't match.
So you don't think it's fair?
I don't think it's been accurate. I really don't. Look, it's how I describe it to people. If there was a sort of concerted anti-Trump media effort over the course of the last 2 weeks, it would look just like this. I have no evidence that it is. I have nothing but circumstantial evidence. But face it, the headlines have been pretty horrible against him. He didn't say he wanted to shoot Liz Cheney or put her in front of a firing squad. He didn't say he wanted to physically hit Michelle Obama, which is the story that's going out today. I get it. But look, I don't think it makes any difference because there aren't any undecided voters left. I think it's just a question of whether or not the people who know how they want to vote are going to show up and vote. And that's why you're seeing this last-minute run into Pennsylvania, run into Michigan from all the campaigns, because they know that's where the election's going to be won and lost.
Well, there may not be many undecided voters left, Mick, but there are recently decided voters, if you believe the New York Times and Siena poll that looked at the battleground states. And it found that the 8% of voters that said they had only just made up their minds polled for Harris by a margin of 11 points, 55 to 44% for Trump. Do you believe that?
I'd have to see the actual polling to see. Do I think there might be a bias against Trump in a New York Times poll? Yes, I do. But look, if they're right, then the election will be over on election evening, right? If it's that much of a break from the undecideds to Kamala Harris, then you'll know by 10 o'clock that night as to whether or not she had won. So the proof will be in the pudding. I just hope that if he does win, and I still think this is a coin toss election, there'll be some real scrutiny given to this media coverage in the last couple of weeks because clearly it has been heavily anti-Trump.
We have spent a lot of time with Don Levy, who runs the Siena College survey operation that feeds the New York Times poll about his methodology, and he's a pretty serious pollster for what it's worth, Mick. But I wonder just broadly, is there a reckoning for pollsters coming out of this election? This is going to have to break one way or the other here, isn't it?
It is. I mean, look, they've been under a great deal of pressure since 2016. Pollsters underpolled Barack Obama in 2012. They underpolled Trump in 16 and 20. Yep. Are they underpolling both of them today? You don't know, but here's a specific example. You look at the Iowa poll that got a lot of attention over the weekend. Oh, my goodness. They're tied in Iowa. 9% undecided? In the weekend before, it was 47 to 44. Last time I checked the math, that only adds up to 91%, which means that 9% in Iowa are supposedly undecided in the weekend of the election. That would be a national news story in and of itself if there were really that many undecided voters. So, but look, politicians like me complain about polls all the time. Every time we're winning, we love the polls. Every time we're losing, we hate the polls. The proof is obviously going to be in the pudding. But let's be honest with each other. The polling industry has had a difficult time properly polling Donald Trump several times over, and they may be having difficulty polling Kamala Harris right now as well. We'll know in about, 48 hours.
Well, we'll see if that's true, Mick. We're all bracing ourselves for the potential for a long-haul vote tally here. But as we consider the fact that Donald Trump himself has thrown a lot of cold water on some of the polls that he is seeing, suggestions in these final stages of the race that he actually thinks he's winning by a lot. I wonder if you take that for bluster or if that may already be sowing the seeds of a contestation of the ultimate results when they come in.
Yeah, I mean, if you didn't have 2020 as a data point, you'd look at it and call it bluster, right? But how can you look at it like that after you've got 2020? Is he laying the foundation for challenging the outcome of the elections? By the way, I don't have a difficulty. Tyler did a nice piece on the lead-in about the number of lawsuits. I have no difficulty with lawsuits. I'm fine with lawsuits. Lawsuits are part of the American electoral process. They just are. There's a reason there are people in this world, in this country, who specialize in election law. We do this all of the time. And the more lawsuits you have, the more confidence you can have that the outcome is correct. You don't get to sit back and go, oh, it was stolen from me, and not present evidence. Either you present evidence as you win, as the Trump campaign has done a couple times already in Pennsylvania, and you lose, as they did, I think, pretty much every time in 2020. So to your point, as he's laying a foundation, ordinarily in a rational world, I'd say no. But with the 2020 in hindsight, you say, yeah, he's probably laying a foundation now for challenging the outcome in some fashion.
Well, with that said, I know you're sensitive to the markets, Mick. When you've got your eyes on Wall Street here and what might follow Tuesday night, what's your thought on how long it's going to take to call this race and the volatility that we could experience? A lot of investors are hedging themselves for both outcomes right now.
Yeah, I saw the VIX number. That doesn't surprise me. I always hate it when you guys give short shrift to the Russell, because it's doing really well today.
Don't forget the small caps.
Let's go IWM. Give it to us, Mick.
That's exactly right. Look, I think it could take a while. I'm giving some speeches next week in Europe, and they're like, look, we want to talk about the outcome of the election. I'm like, there's a really good chance we won't know the outcome of the election. But I know that's what everybody's saying. Let me focus on one thing that is not getting enough attention, I think, which is that the House of Representatives may take the longest to settle. I think the Senate you'll know on election night. The White House you might know late into the morning, maybe a day or two later. Arizona's going to take a long time to finish. If it's that close, it could take a week or so. But the House races, California is notoriously slow in reporting final results from House races. I remember 2010. When I got elected, I was having dinners here in January of 2011 with people who didn't know if they were staying or not. So I think the House race could take a lot longer, and that affects the markets almost as much as the White House, because we'll know if we've got divided government or unified government, depending on the outcome of the other two races.
So how would you be feeling right now if you're Speaker Johnson, Mick?
Both he and Hakeem are on a razor's edge. I know. I talked to some of my Democrat friends. I was in Miami last week with a group of Democrats, and they were really excited about the House, really not excited about the Senate, and starting to get excited about the White House. But then I look at some of the data. I see that Real Clear Politics just moved Virginia 10, which is a race nobody knows about. A guy named Mike Clancy moved from a lean Dem to a toss-up. That makes 3 toss-up races in the state of Virginia alone. My guess is it's why Trump probably spent a little time there over the weekend. The races, Kayleigh, they're so micro at the House level. There's so many local politics, so many local personalities. It's sort of hard to paint with a broad brush unless you have a wave election like you did in 2010. You don't have that here. So I think both Johnson and Hakeem are just absolutely nail-biting it down to the last minute. They're going to be probably a margin of 5 or 6 seats either way by the time it's over.
Then why is Washington so convinced we're going to have a split Congress? I'm of the mind that this might be why we haven't seen more volatility or at least losses on Wall Street going into this contest, because it might not matter so much who the president is if you have a Democratic-run House and a Republican-run Senate.
Two reasons. Washington lives inside the Beltway and watches those same drives the same narratives we talked about in terms of the anti-Trump messaging out of the media. Wall Street has always been a miserable predictor of what happens in Washington, D.C. I keep telling my friends on Wall Street, asking somebody on Wall Street what's happening in D.C. is like asking somebody in D.C. what's happening on Wall Street, and nobody would be stupid enough to do that. So the bottom line is that not enough folks nearly get out into the real world. I drove from Raleigh, North Carolina to Charlotte this weekend through the back roads, and I got to tell you, I think you're going to see North Carolina go for Kamala Harris. I think Donald Trump is going to walk to Georgia, a win in Georgia, but may well lose North Carolina. That's a feel you get when you get out into the real world, talk to folks, and get out in New York and D.C.
Well, and of course, that's where we all find ourselves, Joe and I in New York, and Mick Mulvaney in D.C. We appreciate you joining us, former acting White House Chief of Staff during the Trump administration. We appreciate your time as we have much more coverage still ahead, of course, later today and throughout this election week. We'll be back at 5 p.m. Eastern time on the late edition of Balance of Power, and we'll be joined by Colorado's Democratic Governor Jared Polis and former Virginia Governor, the Republican, Jim Gilmore.
We'll hear from both sides, along with our signature panel. As we mentioned, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano are with us for the week here in Washington as we bear down.
New York.
And make that in New York as well. Yes, that's where we are. We'll figure that out before we meet you back here at 5 p.m. on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.